"Tell me again, Grandpa, what does music look like?" The question hung in the silence of the Lincoln Center lobby as 8-year-old Paisley gripped her grandfather's weathered hand. Edison knew she didn't really expect an answer. She asked this question every time they came to a concert, as if hoping that one day the words might unlock the visual world she'd lost. How does a blind child know exactly where to reach her hand in a crowded theater? What did she hope to find by touching someone she had never seen? And why did André Rieu stop playing the precise moment those tiny fingers found his violin? The music still echoed through the concert hall. The audience hadn't noticed anything yet. But in that moment it became clear that the girl wasn't trying to feel the instrument. She was trying to recognize something she had already lost. And what André understood in that moment made his heart sink. There were some sorrows that even music couldn't bring back. Paisley held tightly to her grandfather's hand as they entered the theater. She couldn't see the grandeur of the space, the crystal chandeliers or the stage at the far end. But she sensed everything in a different way. The sound of footsteps changed as they moved forward. The air grew cooler, and voices echoed differently. For her, this already meant they were in a large, serious place where people spoke more softly than normal. Edison had known theaters since his youth. For decades, he had worked with wood, strings, and varnish, building instruments that others would play. When he began losing his sight, he had to give up the craft. It was during that period that Paisley was born, and ironically, she was the one who came closest to that world he could no longer fully see. He taught his granddaughter something simple: listen with attention and touch with respect. Paisley had lost her sight gradually. First the colors, then the outlines, then the faces. The memories that remained were vague, almost like dreams. Sometimes she said she could still remember her mother's smile, but she wasn't sure if that was memory or imagination. What she never lost was curiosity, especially for music, because that was the only place where she didn't feel disadvantaged. She didn't know exactly who André Rieu was. She only knew that Grandpa spoke about him carefully, like someone who treated music with his hands, not just with technique. For Paisley, that was enough. They didn't want to see the maestro. They wanted to understand how that music was born. When they sat down, Edison quietly explained where the stage was and where the orchestra stood. Paisley nodded in silence. While the audience settled in, she kept her hands in her lap, feeling the vibration of the environment as if the entire theater was about to breathe together. When the first music began, Paisley didn't move. She closed her eyes even tighter, as if that helped her concentrate on the little that remained of images inside her. Each note seemed to occupy a physical space, almost tangible, and without saying anything to her grandfather, she made a silent decision. At some point that evening, she would have to reach out her hand, not to draw attention, but to confirm something she had felt since the music began. The theater was filled with people who came for relaxation, for beauty, for the pleasure of an evening with classical music. But for Paisley, this wasn't entertainment. This was a quest. She had no words for what she sought, but her body knew it. Her hands knew it. Somewhere between those notes, between those vibrations, lay something that belonged to her, even if she couldn't name it. Edison looked at his granddaughter and saw the concentration on her face. He knew that expression. It was the same face she made when touching a new surface, when trying to understand a shape through touch alone. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't searching for something new. She was searching for something old, something forgotten, something that maybe was never really gone. The violin sang through the space, each note a story, each melody an emotion. André Rieu stood on stage, his movements familiar and confident, his face a mask of professional joy. He had done this thousands of times in hundreds of theaters for millions of people. But tonight, without knowing it yet, this would be different, because in the front row sat a small girl who was about to ask a question that needed no words. A question that could only be asked with outstretched fingers, and a heart that wanted to know if memories were real or just dreams that had been cherished too long. The music swelled. The orchestra followed André's lead with precision and passion, and Paisley began leaning forward, millimeter by millimeter, drawn by something greater than herself, something that had no name but had a voice made of violin, strings, and lost times. Paisley didn't warn her grandfather. She didn't ask permission. She just felt she had to do this before the music ended. While André Rieu led the orchestra, She leaned forward slowly, guided only by sound. Each note seemed to point the right direction, as if the violin was calling. Edison noticed the movement too late. He gently touched his granddaughter's arm, an automatic gesture of concern, but Paisley didn't retreat. The audience around remained attentive to the stage without noticing the small hand advancing at the border between audience and orchestra. Paisley's fingers didn't tremble from fear, but from anticipation. She didn't want to touch André Rieu. She didn't know who he was. What she sought was something else, the exact vibration of the music, the point where sound stopped being just heard and began being felt in the body. When her hand finally reached the air before the stage, something happened that no one predicted. André felt the presence before the touch. It wasn't the immediate contact, but the intention. Something in that gesture was different from requests for autographs, selfies, or exaggerated emotion. It was too quiet. The bow slowed almost imperceptibly. Dashiell, the violinist beside him, noticed the change in rhythm and followed instinctively. The music didn't stop, but lost strength for a moment, as if waiting for something to happen. Paisley felt the violin under her fingers for a fraction of a second, the warm wood, the living vibration. And in that exact moment, something broke inside her. It wasn't joy, it was recognition. She had felt this before, and that certainty, sudden and painful, made her hand withdraw as quickly as it had come forward. The audience still hadn't understood anything, but André had. That touch, so brief, had unleashed something in him that he didn't expect. He had shaken thousands of hands, met thousands of people. But this was different. This wasn't admiration. This was a question without words. And the question wasn't directed at him as a person, but at what he held. At the instrument, at the music itself. He tried to continue playing. His body performed the movements automatically, but his mind was elsewhere. Who was this child? Why had she reached out her hand that way? And what had she tried to find in that moment of contact? The orchestra continued playing. The audience noticed nothing of the maestro's inner disturbance. But for André, the world had tilted for a moment. He had learned to keep distance from emotional moments during performances, to stay professional, to let the show go on. But this was something that broke through all barriers. In the front row, Paisley pulled her hand back to her chest, her fingers still trembling from what she had felt. Edison saw it, and his heart contracted. He knew that expression on her face. It wasn't surprise. It was pain. The pain of recognizing something that was lost. The music reached a climax. The notes rose and fell in perfect harmony, and the audience was lost in its beauty. But 3 people in that room were somewhere else. Paisley caught in a memory she thought she had forgotten. Edison knowing what that memory meant, and André feeling that something important had happened that he didn't yet understand. When the number ended, there was applause, loud and enthusiastic. André bowed and smiled, but his eyes searched the front row. He found the girl, her head bowed, her hands still against her chest. She wasn't applauding, she barely moved. And in that moment, André made a decision. This couldn't be left unfinished. He had to know, he had to understand what had just happened, because something in him said this wasn't coincidence, not a simple impulse of a child. This was something deeper, something that needed an answer. But the answer that would come wouldn't be the answer he expected. It wouldn't be a heartwarming story of music saving someone. It would be something much more painful, something that would show that music doesn't always heal. Sometimes it only reminds us of what is lost forever. Paisley pulled her hand back to her lap and remained motionless as if nothing had happened. To anyone looking from the outside, the gesture might seem like simple, childish curiosity. For her, however, it had been a silent shock. The vibration she had felt in the violin wasn't new. It was too familiar. Edison noticed the change immediately. He knew that stiffness in his granddaughter's body. It was the same state she entered when old memories came without warning. He leaned forward and quietly asked if everything was okay. Paisley didn't answer. She just nodded without conviction. On stage, André continued playing, but something had changed. It wasn't a technical error or distraction. It was attention. He played while trying to understand why that brief touch had caused such a strange tightness in his chest. It wasn't a request, it wasn't enthusiasm. It was searching. The music moved forward, but for Paisley, Time had slowed. The brief contact with the violin had awakened a memory she thought was lost. Before she completely lost her sight, when she could still see shadows and lights, there had been an instrument at home, a small violin, resting on the table in the living room. Her mother played little without technique, just repeating the same simple melody. Paisley had never told anyone this. Over the years, that memory had been pushed to a distant corner until it became almost nothing. But the touch on stage had brought everything back. Not the image, but the feeling. The same vibration, the same warmth of the wood. She wasn't trying to get to know the music. She was trying to confirm whether what she remembered still existed. André felt the girl's gaze, even though he couldn't see it directly. When the music ended, the applause came hard as always, but he didn't react immediately. He looked discreetly at the front row, searching for the origin of that silent gesture. Paisley wasn't applauding. She kept her hands closed as if holding something that might escape at any moment, and it was at that moment that André understood what made this moment so heavy. The girl hadn't reached out her hand to win something. She had reached out to discover whether what she had lost had really been part of her life, or if it had only been an old dream. The answer to that would still come, but before that answer could come, something unexpected happened. Valencia, the theater coordinator, came onto the stage with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She whispered something to André, something that made his face tighten. There was a problem with the schedule. The next number had to be shortened. Too many pieces were planned and time was running out. André nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He looked again at Paisley, who now had her head bowed, her fingers still nervously moving on her lap. He made a decision that went against all protocol. He would ignore the schedule. He would make time. He turned to the orchestra and announced there would be a short intermission, a pause for the audience to stretch, to breathe. But it wasn't a pause for the audience. It was a pause for him to do what needed to be done. While the audience began to move, talk, walk to the lobbies, André walked off the stage. Not to the backstage, but to the front row, directly to where Paisley sat with her grandfather. Edison saw him coming, and his eyes widened. This was André Rieu, the maestro, and he was walking straight toward them. He wanted to stand to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. André crouched down in front of Paisley, his violin still in his hand. He said nothing at first. He just waited. And then, with a voice so soft that only she could hear, he asked, "What were you trying to find, little one?" Paisley's breath caught. She hadn't expected anyone to understand. That anyone would know her gesture was more than curiosity. Her lips trembled, and for the first time that evening she spoke. "I wanted to know if it was real. My mother's music." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. André felt something break in his chest. This wasn't a simple story of a child wanting to feel music. This was a child trying to reconstruct a lost past, to confirm a loss too big for words. He looked at Edison, who now had tears in his eyes. The old man nodded slowly, confirming what Paisley had said without needing more words. And in that moment, André realized that what would happen now wouldn't be a moment of joy. It would be a moment of truth, a painful, necessary truth. The applause filled the theater, but to André it sounded distant. He thanked with an automatic gesture, bowed his head, smiled at the orchestra, but his attention was caught elsewhere. In the front row, the blind girl remained motionless, not reacting like the rest of the audience. That confirmed what he already felt. That touch hadn't been a childish impulse. It had been an attempt to recognize something lost. André left the stage earlier than usual, leaving the orchestra to continue with the final thanks. Backstage, he asked that no one dim the lights yet. Valencia found it strange, but obeyed. It wasn't usual for André to change the flow of the concert for something that seemed so small. Meanwhile, Edison leaned toward Paisley again. He carefully asked if she had felt anything strange. Paisley hesitated to answer. When she spoke, it was almost a whisper. She said only that the music hurt in a familiar way. Edison felt his heart contract. He remembered Paisley's mother's violin. He remembered the day the instrument was put away forever, after the illness, after the loss. Minutes later, André appeared through the side aisle, away from the stage lights. There was no hurry in his step. When he stopped in front of Paisley, he said nothing at first. He just crouched down at the same height as her and placed the violin between his hands without playing. "You were trying to remember someone, weren't you?" he asked without preamble. Paisley stiffened. She hadn't expected anyone to understand it so quickly. She nodded slowly. She said she thought that music came from before her blindness, but she wasn't sure if it was real or if she had invented the memory over time. André closed his eyes briefly. He knew that kind of pain. The pain of not knowing if a memory was true or just a wish. Then he did something unexpected. He placed the violin carefully closer and asked if she wanted to touch it again, this time without hurry. Edison held his breath. Paisley reached out her hand again, but now she wasn't trembling. Her fingers glided carefully over the wood like someone confirming something too important to get wrong. When she touched the entire instrument, there was no more doubt. She began crying silently. It wasn't pure sadness, it was raw. Because in that moment, Paisley understood that the memory had been real and that something very precious had indeed been part of her life. It wasn't just the memory of the violin. It was the memory of her mother playing it. Of the warm afternoons in the living room where light filtered through the curtains, of the simple melody that kept repeating, never perfect, but always beloved, and the feeling of safety that came when that music played. And now, with her fingers on André's violin, she felt all those moments return with a clarity that hurt, because they came back only to confirm they were gone forever. Edison couldn't watch any longer without doing something. He placed his hand on Paisley's shoulder, a gesture of support, of understanding. He knew exactly what she was going through because he had been there himself. He had watched his daughter waste away, had lived through her last days, had to put away the violin because it was too painful to look at. André felt helpless, something he rarely experienced on stage. Here he had no control, no script, no way to fix this with a beautiful note or charming smile. This was real grief, and all he could do was witness something he couldn't change. Dashiell, who had been standing at a distance, now came closer. He had seen the whole scene and understood its gravity without anyone needing to explain anything. He knelt beside André and asked quietly, "Can I do something?" André shook his head. "Just stay," he whispered back. And so they remained there, 3 adults and a child, in a circle of shared sorrow. The audience in the foyer knew nothing. For them, this was just an intermission, a moment to relax. But here, in the front row of an almost empty theater, something more important than any music was happening. Paisley's tears came slower now, her fingers still resting on the violin. She took a deep breath and said so softly that André had to lean forward to hear it. "She didn't play well, but I loved it." Those words broke something in André that he didn't know was still whole, because that was the essence of all music, wasn't it? It wasn't about perfection. It was about connection, about love, about memories that linger long after the last note has been silenced. He nodded, unable to speak. And in that nod lay an understanding that went deeper than words, a recognition that some things we lose never come back, but they always remain part of who we are. The theater began filling again. The audience returned to their seats, their conversations fading as they settled in. The intermission was over. The concert would have to continue. But something fundamental had changed. André stood slowly, his knees creaking from crouching. He looked at Paisley, at Edison, and then at Dashiell. "We continue playing," he said. "But first, 1 number for her." Valencia, who was approaching to ask when they could resume, heard this and frowned. "Which number?" she asked. André thought. Then he smiled, a small, sad smile. "Something simple," he said. "Something a mother would play for her child." And while the orchestra regrouped, while the audience sat and waited, André prepared to play. Not for the hundreds of people in the theater, but for one small girl in the front row who had just learned that memories could be real and painful at the same time. Paisley's crying didn't immediately draw attention. There was no fuss, no people coming closer. It was a contained crying, almost silent, as if she had learned very early that some pains don't need an audience. André remained kneeling in front of her without trying to interrupt, without offering quick words. Edison turned his face away for a moment. He knew exactly what his granddaughter had just discovered. It wasn't just a confirmed memory. It was the realization that something beautiful had existed and would never return. The music hadn't given Paisley her sight back, nor her mother's presence, nor the lost time. It had only revealed absence with cruel clarity. André felt a strange weight in his chest. In so many years on stage, he had always believed that music healed, elevated, saved. But here, before this child, it became clear that music could also do something else. Remember, and not every memory comes to comfort. He tried not to reshape the moment into something beautiful. He didn't say everything would be okay, nor that music compensated for loss. He spoke only the truth that seemed necessary. Some things we love pass too quickly, he said in a soft voice, and they hurt precisely because they were real. Paisley nodded, still crying. For the first time since losing her sight, she felt no confusion. It hurt, but it made sense. The memory wasn't imagination. It wasn't an invention of longing. It had existed. Her mother had really played that violin. That music had really been part of her life, even if only briefly. Valencia observed from a distance, not knowing whether to intervene. This wasn't in the program, it wasn't part of any planned experience for the audience. Yet it seemed more important than anything that had happened on stage that evening. André stood slowly and placed the violin back in its case. He wouldn't play anymore tonight. For him, the concert had ended here. Sound still echoed in the theater, but the truest moment had already happened outside the music. Paisley dried her face with the back of her hand and took a deep breath. She didn't smile. She didn't have to. Something inside her had broken, but it was a necessary break. Like when you open something that's been closed too long to finally understand what's inside. And everyone there, even without saying anything, knew this encounter wouldn't be remembered as a beautiful moment, but as an honest one. But what André didn't know was that Paisley's journey didn't end with this moment. In the days that followed, she would do something no one expected. She would ask to go home and go to the closet where her mother's violin was stored. She would ask to hold it, not to play, but to confirm it was real, that her memory hadn't lied. And Edison would give it to her, knowing this would be painful but also necessary, because some memories need to be touched to become real, to go from dreams to reality, even if that reality hurts. Dashiell, who had seen it all, felt changed by the experience. He was used to playing music for joy, for entertainment, for applause. But tonight, he had learned that music could also serve to mourn, to acknowledge, to tell truths too painful for words. He would later tell André that this was the most important concert he had ever participated in, not because the music was perfect, but because it was real, because it reminded him why he became a musician in the first place. The theater began filling again for the second part of the concert. The audience returned, their faces cheerful, their conversations light. They knew nothing of what had just happened in the front row, and that was good. Some moments aren't meant to be shared with the world, they're only for the people who were there. André took his place again on stage, but he wasn't the same man who had left it. He had learned something no conservatory could teach. He had learned that music had power, but not always the power to heal. Sometimes the only power it had was the power to be true, and as he lifted his violin and signaled the orchestra to begin, he looked at Paisley. She sat upright now, her tears dried, her face calm, and for the first time that evening she smiled, a small, sad smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was the smile of someone who had lost something and accepted it. The smile of someone who knew that grief and love were two sides of the same coin, that you couldn't have one without the other. And André understood that this was the real gift music could give. Not escape, not forgetfulness, but recognition. The recognition that what we feel, what we remember, what we lose is all real, and that that's enough. Paisley left the theater holding her grandfather's hand more tightly than when they arrived. Not because she was afraid, but because she needed something steady while everything inside reorganized. That evening hadn't brought comfort. It had brought truth. And for a child who had already lost so much, that was heavy, but also necessary. The ride home was silent. Edison drove through the illuminated streets of Manhattan, while Paisley sat in the back, her head leaning against the window. The vibrations of the engine were familiar, comforting in their own way. But her thoughts were elsewhere. Still in that theater, still with that violin. She thought about the moment of contact, how brief it had been, maybe no more than a few seconds, but how deeply it had dug into her memory. It was as if that touch had opened a door that had been closed for years, and through that door now flowed memories she thought she had lost. She remembered more details now. The way her mother held the violin, a bit awkwardly like someone who respected the instrument, but wasn't completely familiar with it. The way the melody always made the same mistake in the same place, and how that somehow became part of the song itself, a characteristic that made it unique. She remembered the light in the living room, how it changed as afternoon turned to evening. She couldn't really see the light in her memory, but she felt it. The warmth of sunlight filtering through the window and touching her skin while the music played, and she remembered the feeling of safety. That was maybe the most important thing of all. That music, however simple and imperfect, had created a space where nothing bad could happen, where everything was good, where love was tangible in every note. When they got home, Edison helped her out of the car and inside. He asked if she was hungry, if she wanted something to drink. Paisley shook her head. She just wanted to go to bed, just wanted silence, just wanted time to process what had happened. But sleep didn't come easily. She lay in bed, her eyes open in darkness that made no difference from light for her, and thought about what André had said, that some things pass too quickly, that they hurt because they were real. She understood now what he meant. It wasn't the music that hurt. It was the memory of what the music had meant, of who had played it, of time that would never return. That night, Paisley dreamed for the first time in years about her mother. It wasn't a clear dream, no face she could see, but a presence she could feel. In the dream, she sat in the living room and heard the violin playing. The melody was the same as always, with the same small mistake in the same place. And in the dream she didn't cry. She just smiled, knowing this had been real, that this had existed. When she woke up, her cheeks were wet, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of acceptance, of a kind of peace she hadn't known before. In the days that followed, Paisley didn't ask to hear music. She didn't talk about violins. She didn't mention André Rieu. Edison feared it had been too much. He watched his granddaughter carefully, looking for signs of trauma or regression, but what he saw was something else. Quiet, yes, but not empty quiet. It was the quiet of someone who was thinking, processing, understanding something important. At school, her teacher noticed it too. Paisley had always been a good child, but something had changed. She seemed more present, more focused. When the teacher asked if everything was okay, Paisley just nodded and said she was thinking about important things. But a week later, she did something unexpected. It was a Sunday morning. Sun streamed through the kitchen windows while Edison made breakfast. Paisley came into the kitchen, her steps more confident than usual, and said without preamble, "Grandpa, I want to touch Mum's violin." Edison stopped what he was doing. His hands froze above the toaster. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't known when or how. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. "Very sure," Paisley answered. "I need to know if it feels the same as the one in the theater." Edison hesitated. He hadn't touched that violin since the day of the funeral. It had been too painful, too loaded with memories he wasn't ready to face. The violin had become a symbol of everything that was lost, of dreams that hadn't come true, of music that stopped too early. But he saw something in Paisley's face that made him agree, a determination, a need that went beyond curiosity. This was important to her in a way he didn't completely understand, but did respect. He retrieved the case from the attic closet, where it had lain all those years among old boxes and forgotten things. Dust lay thick on the surface, and he carefully wiped it away with his sleeve. His hands trembled as he opened the clasps, the small metal clips that clicked in the silence of the room. And there it was, his daughter's violin, smaller than he remembered, the varnish dulled by time and neglect. But it was still there, intact, waiting. Paisley reached out her hands, and Edison carefully placed the instrument in her grasp. The moment her fingers touched the wood, she stiffened. Edison saw it, and his heart contracted, afraid this was too much, that he should have refused. But then Paisley began slowly moving her fingers. She let them glide carefully over the wood without hurry, exploring every surface, every curve, every imperfection in the wood, every place where her mother's fingers had rested. She felt the strings, old and out of tune but still taut, still ready to make music. And as she felt, she began to speak. Her voice was soft but clear, each word carefully chosen. "It's the same," she said. "It feels exactly the same as in my memory." "That means it was real, doesn't it, Grandpa? Mom really played this. I didn't make it up." "No, little one," said Edison. his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't make it up. It was all real." Paisley nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I wanted to know so badly. I was afraid it was just a dream, something I had created because I missed it so much. But it was real. She held this. She made music with this." She told her grandfather she now understood why that memory hurt. It wasn't because it ended too soon. It was because it had been real enough to leave a mark, a scar that would never heal, but also never disappear. Edison realized in that moment that his granddaughter had become more adult in that one evening than in many years. He sat next to her on the living room floor, and for the first time since losing his daughter, he spoke openly about her. Not in generalities, not in careful half-truths, but really. He told about her as a child, about her dreams of becoming a musician, about how life had gone differently than she had hoped, about how she nonetheless found joy in simple things. He told about the day she bought that violin with money she had saved from her work. It wasn't an expensive violin, no masterpiece of craftsmanship, but it was hers, and she had loved it. He told about how she practiced every evening, just that one melody, because it was the only one she could play without looking at sheet music. He told about how she played for Paisley when she was still a baby, how the music always calmed the child, how there seemed to be a special bond between mother, daughter, and instrument. Paisley listened and felt the violin in her hands grow warmer, as if it was absorbing the words, as if it was coming to life through the memories. She began to understand that this instrument was more than just wood and strings. It was a connection, a bridge between past and present, between loss and life. "Grandpa," she asked after a long silence, her voice hesitant but determined, "do you think Mom would want me to learn to play?" Edison felt tears prick his eyes. He had half expected this question, half feared it. "I think your mother would want you to do what makes you happy, little one. And if music makes you happy, then there's nothing she'd rather want." "But it will also make me sad," Paisley said honestly, her wisdom far beyond her years. "Every time I play, I'll think of her, and that hurts." "Yes," Edison said softly, placing his hand on her shoulder. "But sometimes pain is proof that we have loved, and that's something beautiful in its own way. It's better to feel, even when it hurts, than to feel nothing." Paisley thought about this, her young mind wrestling with concepts many adults never fully understand. Then she nodded slowly, making a decision that would change her life. "Then I want to learn, not to become good like André Rieu, but to be able to play Mom's song in my own way, so it won't be lost." And so began a new phase in Paisley's life. Edison found a teacher, an old friend named Thaddeus who was patient, and more importantly, understood what Paisley was seeking. Not perfection, not fame, but connection. A way to continue the conversation that had been interrupted when her mother left. A way to say what could never be said in words. The first lesson was difficult, perhaps the most difficult of all. Paisley's fingers didn't know where to be, how hard to press, how the bow should move. She produced sounds that resembled creaking more than music, hard, dissonant notes that hurt the ears. But she didn't give up. She kept trying, again and again, her face concentrated, her small hands determined despite the pain in her fingers from pressing the strings. Thaddeus was surprised by her determination. He had had many students in his long career as a teacher, some talented, some hard-working. But he had rarely seen someone with this kind of dedication. This hunger to learn that went beyond musical ambition. "Why is this so important to you?" Thaddeus asked after the third lesson, when Paisley's fingers were bleeding from practice, and she still refused to stop. Paisley thought about the answer, her head tilted as she always did when thinking. "Because," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "when I play, I can feel Mom. Not see her, not hear her voice, but feel her in the vibration, in the way the instrument moves, in the music that comes out. And that's the only thing I still have of her, the only way I can be with her." Thaddeus nodded, deeply moved by her words. He realized he didn't just have a student, but a child who was using music as a form of mourning, of healing, of connection to something that seemed lost forever, but was somehow still present. He changed his approach after that day. Instead of focusing on technique and theory, he taught her to listen, to feel, to let the music come from within instead of from without. He taught her that perfection was less important than honesty, that a note played with feeling was more beautiful than 10 notes played with only technique. For André, the episode remained in silence. He didn't tell it in interviews, didn't make it a public lesson, didn't share it as a heartwarming story. But something deep in him changed. Every time someone said music healed everything, he remembered the small hand that touched the violin and pulled back, crying. The music hadn't healed Paisley. It had done something more honest. It had allowed her to recognize her own history, to feel her grief without shame, to honor her love without trying to replace it. He began thinking differently about his performances, not as entertainment only, not as escape from reality, but as moments of possible connection, of possible truth. He became more careful with his words, more aware of the power music had, not only to bring joy but also to reveal pain, awaken memories, confirm losses. In his dressing room, before each concert, he took a moment to reflect on why he did this. Not for fame, not for applause, though those things were pleasant, but for moments like the one with Paisley. Moments that reminded him of the humanity behind music, of the lives that were touched, of the stories told without words. Months later, he received a letter from Edison. The old man didn't write often, his hands stiff with age, but this letter was carefully written, each word considered. He told about Paisley's progress, about how slowly but surely she was learning her mother's song. He didn't thank André for the music that evening, but for the honest moment, for not trying to make it beautiful when it wasn't beautiful, for allowing grief to have its own space. André kept that letter in the pocket of his concert jacket, where he could feel it every time he prepared to perform. It was his reminder, his grounding, his connection to why music truly mattered. Months passed and became years. Paisley's fingers became steadier, her notes purer. She slowly but surely learned the melody her mother had played. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect, but it was hers. It was real. It carried the essence of what had been and what still was. The first time she played the entire song without stopping, from beginning to end, Edison sat in his favorite chair in the living room, exactly where he always sat when his daughter played. His eyes were closed, listening not just with his ears, but with his entire being. And for a moment, for those few minutes the music played, his daughter was back. Not in body, but in spirit, living in the music her child played, passed from generation to generation, as all important things are passed. When the song ended and the last note faded into the silence of the room, Edison opened his eyes. Paisley still sat with the violin, her face peaceful in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. "She would be proud of you," he said, his voice broken with emotion. "I know," Paisley answered simply. "I can feel it." The lesson of that evening wasn't about victory, nor about miracles, nor about happy endings. It was about respect for pain. Some losses don't exist to be repaired, only to be acknowledged. And running from them protects no one. It only postpones understanding. Paisley didn't come out stronger because it stopped hurting. She came out stronger because she learned that feeling pain didn't erase what had been lived. On the contrary, it confirmed that it mattered. And sometimes the most human gesture someone can make is not trying to save, solve, or diminish another's pain. It's simply allowing it to be felt without haste and without spectacle. Years later, when Paisley was 16 and had mastered not just her mother's simple melody, but dozens of complex pieces, she would return to Lincoln Center. This time not as a grieving child seeking confirmation of memory, but as a young woman who understood that music's greatest power wasn't in its ability to heal, but in its capacity to witness. She would play that night in a youth orchestra concert, the same melody her mother had played, imperfect but filled with love. And in the audience, Edison would sit with tears streaming down his face, knowing that some things can be lost and found simultaneously, that grief can transform into something beautiful without ever disappearing entirely. André Rieu, who happened to be in the audience that night for a colleague's performance, would recognize something familiar in the music. Not the melody itself, but the intention behind it. The same searching quality he had felt years ago from small fingers touching his violin. After the concert, he would approach the young violinist backstage. "I remember you," he would say simply. And Paisley, now confident in her understanding of loss and love, would smile. Not the sad smile of a child, but the knowing smile of someone who had learned that music doesn't erase pain, but transforms it into something bearable, something beautiful, something true. "Thank you," she would tell him, "for letting it hurt when it needed to hurt." And André would understand that this moment of recognition between two people who had shared an honest encounter with grief was why music existed at all, not to provide easy comfort, but to acknowledge the full spectrum of human experience, to say, what you feel is real, what you've lost mattered, and you are not alone in this complex dance between love and loss that defines being human. The story would end there, in that moment of mutual understanding. But the music, the real music, the music that comes from lived experience and honest emotion, would continue forever, passed from one generation to the next, carrying within it all the joy and sorrow that makes life precious, precisely because it is finite.